The gunshot echoed across the Montana prairie, silencing the chirping crickets as Grace Sullivan clutched her bloodied side and stumbled toward the distant lights of Wildwood Creek. It was 1876, and the frontier town represented her last hope of survival after escaping the clutches of the notorious Wilkes gang, who had left her for dead after robbing the stagecoach she'd been traveling on from St. Louis. Dawn painted the sky in hues of pink and gold as Grace finally reached the town's edge. Her once pristine blue traveling dress was torn and stained with dirt and blood. Her chestnut hair had fallen from its pins, cascading in wild tangles around her pale face. The wound in her side throbbed mercilessly, but the physical pain paled in comparison to the hollowness in her chest. Everything she had, her money, her letters of introduction, her very future, had been stolen. Exhaustion overwhelmed her as she stumbled onto the town's main street. Grace's vision blurred, the buildings swaying before her eyes. She barely registered the sound of approaching hoofbeats before her knees buckled beneath her. "Whoa there!" A deep voice called out as strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. Grace found herself looking up into the most striking blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-bronzed face beneath the brim of a well-worn cowboy hat. "Help!" she whispered, her voice barely audible as darkness threatened to claim her. "You're hurt," the stranger observed, his expression growing concerned as he noticed the blood seeping through her dress. "I'm taking you to Doc Miller." Grace wanted to protest, to explain that she had no means to pay a doctor, but consciousness slipped away before she could form the words. When she awoke, Grace found herself in an unfamiliar bed, clean bandages wrapped around her midsection. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, illuminating a modest but tidy bedroom. She tried to sit up, gasping as pain shot through her side. "Easy now," came that same deep voice from earlier. The cowboy who had rescued her rose from a chair in the corner, crossing to her bedside with a glass of water. "Doc says you need to rest." Up close, Grace could see that her rescuer was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 25 or 26. His features were strong and handsome, with a square jaw shadowed by stubble and those remarkable blue eyes that crinkled slightly at the corners. "Thank you," Grace murmured, accepting the water gratefully. "I'm Grace Sullivan." "Rowan Quinn," he replied with a slight tip of his head. "Rancher outside of town." "Mr. Quinn," Grace paused, overwhelmed by the enormity of her situation. "I was robbed. The stagecoach was attacked. I have nothing to pay the doctor with." Rowan shook his head. "Don't worry about that now. Doc's a friend, and I covered it anyway." Fresh tears welled in Grace's eyes. "I can't possibly repay you. Everything I had was taken. You're alive. That's what matters," Rowan said simply. "Doc Miller says you're lucky. The bullet just grazed you, though you lost a fair amount of blood." "Where am I?" Grace asked, looking around the unfamiliar room. "My sister's boarding house. Martha runs this place in town while I handle the ranch. You can stay here until you're back on your feet." Grace's throat tightened with emotion. "That's very generous, but no arguments," Rowan said firmly. "Martha's already taken a shine to you, and she'd have my hide if I didn't make sure you were properly looked after." Before Grace could respond, the door opened and a cheerful woman with the same striking blue eyes as Rowan entered carrying a tray. "Oh, you're awake. Wonderful," she exclaimed. "I'm Martha Quinn. I've brought you some broth and tea. You must be famished, poor dear." Over the next few days, Grace recovered her strength under Martha's motherly care. She learned that Rowan and Martha had lost their parents to influenza 5 years earlier, leaving Rowan to run the family ranch while Martha opened the boarding house in town. Their kindness to a complete stranger overwhelmed Grace, especially when Martha insisted on lending her clothes until she could acquire new ones. A week after her arrival, Grace sat on the porch of the boarding house, watching the bustle of Wildwood Creek's main street. The town was larger than she'd initially realized, with a general store, saloon, bank, and even a small schoolhouse. Martha had explained that the recent discovery of silver in the nearby mountains had brought prosperity to what had once been a sleepy cattle town. "Feeling better?" Rowan's voice startled her from her thoughts. She hadn't seen him since that first day, as he'd returned to his ranch outside town. "Much, thank you," Grace replied, offering him a small smile. "Your sister has been very kind." Rowan leaned against the porch railing, studying her with those intense blue eyes. Martha says you were headed to Silver Springs before the robbery. Grace nodded. I was to be a teacher there. I had a position waiting, but now. She gestured helplessly. My letters of introduction were stolen, along with everything else. Our schoolteacher here in Wildwood retired last month, Rowan said thoughtfully. Town's been looking for a replacement. Hope fluttered in Grace's chest. Do you think they would consider me without references? I reckon my word and Martha's would count for something, Rowan replied. I'm on the town council. I could speak to Mayor Hargrove tomorrow if you'd like. Grace's eyes welled with tears of gratitude. I don't know how to thank you. No need for thanks, Rowan said, shifting uncomfortably under her emotional gaze. It's what neighbors do for each other out here. True to his word, Rowan arranged a meeting with Mayor Hargrove the following day. To Grace's relief, the mayor was desperately eager to fill the teaching position before the school term began in 2 weeks. After a brief interview where Grace demonstrated her knowledge, the job was hers, along with a small cabin behind the schoolhouse that served as the teacher's residence. As Grace settled into her new role in Wildwood Creek, she found herself watching for Rowan's visits to town. He typically came in once a week for supplies, and he always made time to check on her progress at the school. His quiet strength and understated kindness touched something deep within her, though she tried to ignore the flutter in her heart whenever he was near. One Saturday afternoon in late September, Grace was organizing books in her classroom when a shadow fell across the doorway. Miss Sullivan, Rowan greeted her, hat in hand. Hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Grace said, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Just preparing for Monday's lessons. Rowan nodded, looking uncharacteristically nervous. I was wondering if you might like to join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant tonight. To celebrate your first month of teaching. Grace felt her cheeks warm. That would be lovely, Mr. Quinn. Rowan, he corrected her with a small smile. After all we've been through, I think we can dispense with formalities. Rowan, Grace repeated, returning his smile. Then you must call me Grace. That evening marked the beginning of a courtship that set the town talking. Rowan called on Grace regularly, taking her on buggy rides through the countryside or accompanying her to town socials. Grace found herself falling deeply for the quiet, steadfast rancher who had saved her life and helped her build a new one. As autumn turned to winter, Grace thrived in her role as Wildwood Creek's teacher. The children adored her, and she had won the respect of their parents with her dedication and intelligence. She had made friends in town, particularly with Martha, who had become like a sister to her. Yet despite her growing happiness, Grace was haunted by the shadows of her past. She had told Rowan and the others that she had come west to teach after the death of her parents, which was partially true. What she hadn't revealed was that she was fleeing a scandal in St. Louis that would destroy her new life if it ever came to light. The first snow of winter had just fallen when Rowan arrived at Grace's cabin one evening with a troubled expression. What's wrong? Grace asked, instantly concerned by his serious demeanor. The Wilkes gang has been spotted near Silver Creek, he said grimly. The marshal thinks they might be heading this way. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. The men who robbed my stagecoach. Rowan nodded. I want you to be careful. Don't travel alone, especially outside town. Do you think they would recognize me? Grace whispered, fear clutching at her heart. It's been months, and you were just another passenger to them, Rowan reassured her. But still, I'd feel better knowing you're taking precautions. In the days that followed, Grace jumped at every unexpected noise, terrified that her past was about to catch up with her, both the robbery and the secret she had fled from in St. Louis. Her nerves were stretched thin, and Rowan noticed her distress despite her attempts to hide it. Something's troubling you beyond the gang, he observed one evening as they sat by the fire in her small cabin. You know you can tell me anything, Grace. Grace stared into the flames, knowing she owed Rowan the truth if their relationship was to have any future. Yet she feared losing him once he knew. Before I came west, she began haltingly, I was engaged to a man named Edward Thornton in St. Louis. He was from a prominent family, and the match was considered quite advantageous. Rowan's expression remained neutral, though his jaw tightened slightly at the mention of another man. 3 weeks before our wedding, I discovered he had a terrible gambling problem and had accumulated enormous debts, Grace continued. When I confronted him, He became violent. Rowan's hands clenched into fists. Did he hurt you? Grace nodded, tears filling her eyes. He struck me when I threatened to break off the engagement. I fell against his desk and knocked over a lamp. The fire spread quickly. The entire room was engulfed in minutes. You escaped, Rowan said softly. Yes, but Edward didn't. He was trapped. Grace's voice broke. The authorities ruled it an accident, but Edward's family blamed me. They spread rumors that I had deliberately set the fire after learning Edward intended to break our engagement. My reputation was ruined. No one would hire me as a teacher in St. Louis, so I accepted the position in Silver Springs. Grace couldn't meet Rowan's eyes. I'm not the innocent victim you believe me to be. Edward's death is on my conscience, even if it was an accident. The silence that followed seemed endless. When Grace finally gathered the courage to look at Rowan, she found not judgment in his eyes, but compassion. You defended yourself against a man who betrayed and hurt you, Rowan said firmly. What happened after was a tragic accident, not your fault. Grace shook her head, tears streaming down her face. You don't understand. In the eyes of society, I'm ruined. If people here knew, the folks here judge a person by their actions, not by rumors from back east, Rowan interrupted. You've proven yourself a good woman, Grace. That's what matters. His unwavering faith in her only made Grace cry harder. She had carried this burden alone for so long. The tension in town mounted as reports of the Wilkes gang grew more frequent. By Christmas, they had robbed 2 banks in neighboring settlements, and Marshal Jenkins had organized a town watch. Rowan divided his time between his ranch and Wildwood Creek, determined to keep Grace safe. The Christmas Eve social at the town hall was a welcome respite from the anxiety that had gripped Wildwood Creek. Evergreen boughs and red ribbons decorated the hall, and a massive fir tree stood in the corner adorned with paper ornaments made by Grace's students. For a few hours, the townspeople forgot their fears as they danced and sang carols. Grace stood near the refreshment table, watching Rowan across the room as he spoke with Mayor Hargrove. He looked handsome in his Sunday best, his usually windswept hair tamed for the occasion. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and smiled, excusing himself to join her. May I have this dance, Miss Sullivan? He asked with exaggerated formality that made her laugh. You may, Mr. Quinn, she replied, placing her hand in his. As they waltzed across the floor, Grace felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Here in Rowan's arms, with the townspeople she had come to care for surrounding them, she could almost believe that her past would stay buried. The illusion shattered 3 days later when a stranger arrived on the afternoon stage. Grace was dismissing her students for the day when Martha burst into the schoolroom, her face pale. Grace, there's a man asking for you at the boarding house, she said urgently. Says he's from St. Louis. Claims to be Edward Thornton's brother. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Grace's feet. James Thornton is here? In Wildwood Creek. Martha nodded grimly. He's telling anyone who'll listen that you're responsible for his brother's death. Says you set the fire deliberately after Edward discovered you'd been stealing from him. That's a lie. Grace gasped. Edward was the thief. He gambled away his family's money and mine. I believe you, Martha said firmly, but he's creating quite a stir. Rowan's on his way in from the ranch, but I thought you should know right away. Grace sank into her chair, her worst nightmare realized. Everything I've built here will be destroyed. Not if we don't let it be, Martha insisted. The people here know you, Grace. They won't be swayed by some stranger's accusations. But Grace had seen how quickly public opinion could turn. By evening, the whispers had already begun. Parents who had greeted her warmly that morning now averted their eyes when they passed her on the street. Mayor Hargrove had requested a meeting for the following day to discuss the situation. Rowan found Grace in her cabin that night, packing her meager belongings with trembling hands. What are you doing? He demanded, closing the door behind him. What does it look like? Grace replied, not meeting his eyes. I'm leaving before they force me out. No one's forcing you anywhere, Rowan said firmly. I've spoken with James Thornton. The man's story has more holes than my old work shirt. Grace paused, a folded dress in her hands. What do you mean? For one thing, he claims Edward died in November of last year, but you were teaching in St. Louis until April, Rowan explained. Martha telegraphed a friend in St. Louis this afternoon. She confirmed Edward Thornton died in May, just as you said. Hope flickered in Grace's chest, but she quashed it. It doesn't matter. The damage is done. The town will never trust me now. You're wrong, Rowan insisted, stepping closer and taking her hands in his. Mayor Hargrove already suspects Thornton is lying. Several townspeople have come forward saying he offered to make the scandal go away for a price. He's trying to extort money? Grace asked incredulously. Rowan nodded. Marshal Jenkins is holding him at the jail now on suspicion of fraud. Apparently, this isn't the first time he's targeted women with this scheme. Relief flooded through Grace, making her knees weak. Rowan guided her to a chair, kneeling before her. I thought I'd lost everything again, she whispered. You haven't lost anything, Rowan assured her. Least of all me. The following day, James Thornton was escorted onto the eastbound stage by Marshal Jenkins after being exposed as a con man with no relation to the Thornton family of St. Louis. The real James Thornton, as Martha's telegram confirmed, was currently in Europe on business. As the dust from the departing stagecoach settled, Grace found herself surrounded by townspeople offering apologies for doubting her. Mayor Hargrove personally assured her that her position as teacher was secure, and several mothers invited her to tea as if to reaffirm her standing in the community. The new year of 1877 began with a sense of renewal for Grace. The Wilkes gang had been captured near Denver, eliminating that threat, and her position in Wildwood Creek seemed stronger than ever after weathering James Thornton's false accusations. One crisp January evening, Rowan invited Grace for a sleigh ride through the snow-covered countryside. Bundled in blankets and furs, they glided across the white landscape, the only sounds the jingling of the sleigh bells and the soft whisper of runners on snow. Rowan guided the horses to a stop atop a hill overlooking his ranch. In the moonlight, Grace could see the sprawling property with its sturdy main house and barn. It's beautiful, she said softly. It needs a woman's touch, Rowan replied, his voice unusually hesitant. My mother had flower gardens all around the house. They've gone wild since she passed. Grace turned to find him watching her intently. Are you asking me to help you plant flowers, Rowan Quinn? A smile tugged at his lips. I'm asking for more than that, Grace Sullivan. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. I'm asking if you'd consider making it your home. With me. As my wife. Grace's heart soared as Rowan opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small diamond. Rowan, I know it's not fancy like you might have had back east, he said apologetically. But my love for you is solid as this ranch. It's perfect, Grace whispered, tears of joy forming in her eyes. And yes, I would be honored to be your wife. The kiss they shared beneath the winter stars sealed a promise of a future neither had dared hope for months earlier. Their wedding in April was the social event of the season in Wildwood Creek. The entire town turned out to see their beloved schoolteacher marry the quiet rancher who had won her heart. Martha served as Grace's maid of honor, while Mayor Hargrove stood as Rowan's best man. After the ceremony in the white-clapboard church, the celebration moved to the town hall, where tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in the community. As fiddles played and people danced, Grace found a moment of quiet reflection, marveling at how her life had changed in less than a year. Happy, Mrs. Quinn? Rowan asked, appearing at her side with 2 glasses of punch. Completely, Grace replied, accepting the drink with a smile. Though I'm not sure the children will ever get used to calling me Mrs. Quinn instead of Miss Sullivan. They'll adjust, Rowan said, slipping an arm around her waist. Just as you'll adjust to being a rancher's wife as well as a teacher. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. I never imagined finding this kind of happiness again. After everything that happened in St. Louis, I thought I was damaged somehow. Unworthy. Grace, Rowan said softly, turning her to face him. You never were. The next morning, as they prepared to leave for a brief honeymoon in Denver, Grace found herself overwhelmed by emotion as she packed the few possessions from her teacher's cabin to move to the ranch. The memories of that desperate night she had arrived in Wildwood Creek, bleeding and hopeless, crashed over her. Rowan found her sitting on the edge of the bed, tears streaming down her face. Grace? What's wrong? He asked, alarmed. Nothing, she said, trying to smile through her tears. I was just thinking about how far I've come since that night you found me half dead in the street. Rowan knelt before her, taking her hands in his. You've built a life here through your own strength and determination. I just helped a little at the beginning. Don't touch me, Grace whispered, pulling her hands away as fresh tears flowed. I'm ruined. What? Rowan asked, confusion evident in his blue eyes. That's what I believed, Grace explained. That night in my cabin, when I told you about Edward and the fire. Deep down I believed I was ruined, tainted by what happened. That no decent man would want me once he knew the truth. Understanding dawned in Rowan's expression. He gently cupped her face in his calloused hands, using his thumbs to wipe away her tears. You're my treasure, he said firmly, pressing a tender kiss to her forehead. Nothing in your past could change that. Nothing ever will. Grace leaned into his touch, the last of her barriers falling away. I love you, Rowan Quinn. And I love you, Grace Quinn, he replied, sealing the promise with a kiss. As they rode out of Wildwood Creek that afternoon, Grace took one last look at the town that had given her a second chance. The schoolhouse where she would continue to teach, the boarding house where Martha had nursed her back to health, the church where she had become Rowan's wife, all of it had become precious to her. Ready for our new beginning? Rowan asked, following her gaze. Grace smiled, turning to face the road ahead. With you? Always. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Grace continued teaching while helping Rowan expand the ranch. Their first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth after Grace's mother, arrived the following spring, followed 2 years later by a son they called Michael after Rowan's father. By 1885, the Quinn Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory, and Grace had been appointed headmistress of Wildwood Creek's expanded school. Their home was filled with laughter, love, and the occasional chaos that comes with raising spirited children. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Rowan surprised Grace with a trip back to St. Louis, not to revisit painful memories, but to finally lay them to rest. Standing on the banks of the Mississippi, arm in arm with the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved, Grace felt the last shadows of her past dissolve in the bright light of her present happiness. Any regrets? Rowan asked as they watched the sunset paint the river gold. Grace shook her head, leaning into his embrace. Not one. Every step of my journey, even the painful ones, led me to you. To us, Rowan corrected, kissing the top of her head. To us, Grace agreed, her heart full of gratitude for the cowboy who had seen her value when she could not see it herself. And as they returned home to Wildwood Creek, to their children and the life they had built together, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true place in the world, not ruined, but treasured beyond measure.